The sound of traffic filled the air as Helena Marquez looked out the window of her car. The drive to court was routine, but today, a feeling of lightness accompanied her. After years of struggle and dedication, she finally felt that she had achieved balance. The daughter of a maid, Helena grew up with a keen sense of justice. Observing the inequalities around her from an early age, she decided that if she had the chance, she would be the one to make a difference in the world. And so she did. Now, as a judge, her name was synonymous with integrity and respect. She had built a career that few believed was possible for someone like her, a woman, black, and from a humble family. But Helena did not let herself be fooled by the praise and status. She knew that, for many, her rise to the top was still viewed with disbelief, as if she were out of place. However, in her day-to-day life, the strength she carried came from the knowledge that each decision she made in court had the power to change lives. Furthermore, her family life gave her stability. Married to Roberto, a literature professor and mother of 2 teenage children, she found support in her family to keep going. At home, the laughter and conversations about her children's future were a necessary break from the reality of her work. It was there that she allowed herself to be just Helena, without the robe or the weight of responsibilities. Today would be an important day in court. A delicate hearing awaited her decision, and Helena knew that her trial would have repercussions throughout the city. Yet as she drove through the streets, she felt serene, confident that she was prepared for whatever lay ahead. Her thoughts alternated between the hearing and the small concerns of everyday life. She was so immersed that she failed to notice the police car rapidly approaching in her rearview mirror. She sighed, pulling the car over to the side of the road. The approach seemed normal at first glance. While waiting for the police officer to approach, Helena checked her documents again, as she always did. But this time, something in the police officer's gaze as he approached made her uneasy. The tension in the air was the prelude to something Helena had not yet imagined. The police officer stopped beside Helena's window, his hand resting lightly on the holster of his gun. His eyes scanned her suspiciously, and for a moment Helena felt as if the entire weight of her identity was being questioned. Even before he said a word, the discomfort was palpable. She rolled down the window and, with a professional smile, held out her driver's license and the car's registration. "Good morning, sir," she said, keeping her voice firm and polite, as she always did. "Is this your car?" the police officer asked, completely ignoring the documents she offered. Helena was taken aback by his tone. It was aggressive, impersonal. She had been in similar situations before, but there was something in the officer's gaze that made her hesitate. It was as if he had already decided she was wrong before he had even checked any facts. "Yes, it's mine," he replied, taking a deep breath to keep calm. "It's all in my name." The police officer glanced at the documents, but instead of accepting them, he turned to her with a hard expression. "I need you to step out of the car." Helena felt her heart race. There was something deeply unfair and humiliating about that order. She, a respected judge, was being treated like a criminal without justification. Trying to stay in control of the situation, she decided to clarify who she was. "Excuse me, sir. I'm Judge Helena Marquez. I'm on my way to court, and I haven't done anything wrong. I have all the documents here, and the car is also registered in my name." But his words didn't have the expected effect. On the contrary, the police officer gave a half smile, something cold and mocking, as if his explanation meant nothing. "I told you to get out of the car now." His voice rose, loaded with an authority that bordered on intimidation. Helena hesitated. Her mind was racing, torn between the desire to obey and the feeling that she was about to be the victim of an act of pure prejudice. Memories of so many stories of abuse of power came flooding back, stories that she herself had tried in court. With a heavy sigh, she opened the door and got out of the car. As soon as she was standing, the police officer roughly pushed her against the vehicle, handcuffing her unceremoniously. The cold metal on her wrists seemed like a brutal confirmation that her position, her achievements, were nothing to protect her at that moment. The feeling of helplessness invaded her, and Helena felt the first tears form, not from fear, but from pure frustration and humiliation. There, in full view of everyone, she was just another black woman being treated as a suspect. A few tense minutes passed until another police officer arrived, apparently calmer. He looked at the situation, questioned his colleague, and, after a brief discussion, removed Helena's handcuffs. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, ma'am. You're free," the new officer said, his voice strained. But the damage was already done. Helena climbed back into her car, her hands still shaking. The scars from that encounter, though invisible, would be etched on her forever. Back in the car, Helena felt a whirlwind of emotions that left her on the verge of collapse. Driving to the courthouse, something that had always been automatic, now seemed like an immense effort. Her mind kept going back over and over to what had happened. The look of disdain from the police officer, the way he had treated her with contempt, and most of all, the humiliation of being publicly handcuffed. When she arrived at the courthouse, something had changed in her. Normally confident, Helena now felt that the weight of her robe no longer protected her as it once did. Every glance from her colleagues, even the most neutral ones, seemed loaded with judgment. It was as if her vulnerability was stamped on her forehead, as if everyone could see the invisible scar left by prejudice. In the courtroom, everything seemed to be going on as usual. Lawyers, defendants, and judges moved around the building, ready for another day of hearings and sentencing. But to Helena, that familiar atmosphere of justice now seemed cold, distant. She sat in her chair, adjusting the papers in front of her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The police officer's words echoed in her mind, a wound that would not heal. As the hearing began, Helena struggled to maintain her composure. The room was full, and the eyes on her awaited her decisions with the same confidence as ever. But her voice, steady out of habit, seemed charged with a new kind of insecurity. Every word she said seemed shrouded in a shadow, as if a part of her had been erased in that moment on the street. She tried to focus on the case at hand, a complex custody case involving a family torn apart by internal conflict, but the image of the police officer intruded at every break. She began to wonder if, like the police officer, others also saw her as just a black woman, a person whose worth was constantly questioned despite her accomplishments. Did everyone who saw her in the robe feel the same doubt, the same distrust, deep down? When the hearing ended, Helena quickly left the room, avoiding the stares that seemed to weigh more heavily than usual. She isolated herself in her office, sitting at her desk with her hands shaking slightly. For a moment, what had happened seemed surreal. But the reality of the prejudice she had experienced was undeniable, and she knew she needed to process what she was feeling. However, instead of opening up to anyone or reporting what had happened, Helena chose silence. That day, the barrier that separated her from the world around her seemed even higher. Although her achievements were real, Helena now felt that at any moment, someone could try to tear down everything she had built. And at that moment, she began to question her place in that court and even in the society that surrounded her. During the following days, Helena maintained her routine in court, but something inside her had changed. The episode with the police officer seemed to follow her like a shadow, affecting the way she saw the world and, especially, herself. At work, her posture remained impeccable, her verdicts remained accurate, but inside her, a conflict was unfolding. In those days, Helena avoided talking about what had happened to Roberto. Her husband had always been her greatest confidant, but something kept her from sharing that experience. Perhaps it was the fear of appearing fragile, of admitting that, despite her outward strength, that encounter with prejudice had shaken her more deeply than she wanted to admit. She didn't want to worry her family, especially her children, who saw her as a figure of power and inspiration. Instead of talking, Helena took refuge in silence. Her moments of rest, previously filled with lively family conversations, now seemed empty. Sitting at the dinner table, she listened to discussions about her children's daily lives and Roberto's stories about his classes, but she rarely participated actively. What consumed her internally was the feeling of helplessness that still tormented her. Alone in her home office, Helena reread the court case documents, but her mind wandered. She wondered what it represented. The humiliation had not been an isolated incident. For her, it was a cruel reminder that, despite all her achievements and accomplishments, racism still existed in every layer of society, ready to resurface at any moment, like an unexpected blow. At night, after everyone had gone to bed, Helena found herself staring at the mirror. Who was she now, after that day? A woman who had fought so hard to be recognized for her merits, but who, in an instant, was reduced to a nameless suspect only because of the stigma that her skin color carried. She knew she couldn't go on like this, that her silence would only lead her deeper into a spiral of pain and isolation. But the words wouldn't come. Sharing this vulnerability seemed to expose a part of her that she never wanted anyone to see. Not even Roberto. As the days passed, the weight of it grew. In court, she remained professional, but at home, her spirit was withdrawn. A part of Helena yearned to find a way to deal with this, but another, the hurt and proud part, kept her trapped in her own silence. But the universe had other ways of bringing healing, and she would soon discover that to overcome that pain, she would first need to reconnect with her inner strength. Helena's silence did not go unnoticed by Roberto. He knew his wife too well to believe that everything was fine, despite her calm exterior. Her absences during conversations and her lost gazes were clear signs that something was wrong. On several nights, he tried to start a conversation, asking about the court, about how she was feeling. However, Helena always limited herself to brief answers, keeping the real storm inside her. That night, as she sat on the couch with an open book but her eyes fixed on a distant point, Roberto decided to insist. He came over and sat next to her, the silence between them stretching for a few seconds before he spoke. "Helena, what's going on? You're not like that. I know something's bothering you. Please tell me." Helena looked at him, her eyes tired, and for the first time, a hint of vulnerability pierced her armor. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words still felt trapped, as if admitting them would confirm her fragility. After a long sigh, she finally broke the silence. "A few days ago, I was stopped by a police officer," she began hesitantly, "and I was treated like a criminal, handcuffed, humiliated." Roberto listened silently, without interrupting, as she described the encounter with the police officer, every detail of the humiliation, the blatant prejudice, and what it had done to her. As Helena spoke, the words began to flow more easily, as if finally, after days of stifling the pain, she had found the courage to release everything she had been holding in. "I felt so helpless, Roberto," she confessed, her voice shaking a little. "And the worst part is that, even with who I am, even with everything I've achieved, it seems like none of it matters. Not to people like that police officer. I've been reduced to a suspect, just for being who I am." Roberto looked at her with sadness and understanding. He knew that, despite Helena's undeniable strength, this type of attack, this type of racism, had an unbearable weight because it reached the soul. "That's terrible, Helena," he said softly, touching her hand. "But you can't let that define you. You are so much more than what that man made you feel." She shook her head, but he could see the impact of that experience still gnawing at her. "I know," she said, almost whispering, "but it's been hard. I can't stop thinking about it, and I feel weak that I can't get through it on my own." Roberto held her hands firmly. "It's not weakness to feel what you're feeling. It's human. You've been through something traumatic, and it's natural that you need time to process it. But you don't have to face this alone. I'm here. Your friends, your family, we're all here. And you also have the court, your work, which can be a way for you to transform this pain into something stronger, into action." Helena looked at him, her eyes shining with tears that she tried to hold back. For so long, she believed that dealing with her struggles alone was part of her identity. But in that moment, she realized that allowing herself to be vulnerable was also a form of strength. She didn't have to carry everything alone. Roberto smiled at her, and for the first time in days, Helena felt the weight on her chest lift a little. Her husband's words didn't erase what had happened, but somehow, they began to create a bridge to something greater, a path to healing. The next day, after sharing what had happened with Roberto, Helena woke up with a different feeling. Although the wound of prejudice was still present, something in her perspective was beginning to change. She realized that she could no longer carry this alone, and that the silence that had once seemed like a fortress was now in fact, a prison. In court, as she reviewed the day's cases, Helena made a decision. She would call her friend Carolina, a civil rights advocate with whom she had worked on several social justice causes. Carolina was one of the few people Helena trusted completely and who would understand the depth of what she was going through. When Carolina answered the phone, her warm voice immediately brought a comfort that Helena didn't know she needed. After a few minutes of casual conversation, Helena got straight to the point. "Carolina, I need to tell you something that happened to me. Something that shook me deeply." On the other end of the line, Carolina remained silent, giving her the space she needed to speak. Helena then detailed the incident with the police officer, holding nothing back. As she spoke, she realized that recounting what had happened to someone who understood the nuances of systemic racism was incredibly liberating. When she finished, Carolina paused before responding. "Helena, what happened to you is terrible, and unfortunately, it is not uncommon. But what matters now is what you will do with it. You are a powerful woman, a judge who has the ability to influence so many lives. You have a voice. Use it. Don't let this experience silence you." Carolina's words resonated deeply. Until that moment, Helena had tried to ignore the pain, but now she began to see that she could channel this experience into something greater. The incident, rather than being a source of shame and humiliation, could be a catalyst for change, not just within herself, but also in the courtroom, in society, and for others who face the same kind of prejudice on a daily basis. That afternoon, Helena left the courthouse with a new determination. She knew she had to take action, and that would start with a meeting with court leadership, where she would share her story and suggest stronger measures to address bias and discrimination within the justice system. As she drove home, Helena felt a transformation begin. The incident with the police officer was still an open wound, but now she was willing to face it head-on. She would no longer let it define her. Instead, she would use her position of power to ensure that no other Black woman, or anyone else, would have to go through this without their voices being heard. Helena knew it wouldn't be easy. She would face resistance, criticism, and perhaps even attempts to silence her. But now she was ready. And this time, instead of suffering in silence, she would choose to speak out. She would choose to fight. With the support of her family, friends, and colleagues, Helena felt she was finally on the right path to transforming her pain into something greater, into strength, into justice, and into real change. The day of the meeting with the court leadership arrived. Helena woke up with a mix of anxiety and determination. She looked at herself in the mirror, adjusting her tie and squaring her shoulders to feel more confident. She wasn't just representing herself. She was representing all the silenced voices, all the injustices that so many people faced. As she entered the courtroom, the atmosphere seemed charged with anticipation. She saw colleagues and superiors gathered in the conference room, most of them with serious expressions, as if they knew a sensitive topic would be discussed. Helena took a deep breath before entering the room. She knew that by speaking out she was taking a risk, but the urge to fight for justice drove her. When everyone was seated, the head of the court, an elderly and respected judge, made a cordial introduction, but Helena could feel the tension in the air. He handed the floor to her, and as he stood, Helena's voice echoed with a force she had not known she had. "Giving me the opportunity to speak. Today, I come here not only as a judge, but as a woman who has experienced prejudice and discrimination in a visceral way. I was recently the target of a humiliation that should not occur in our justice system." The looks in the room changed, and she saw some expressions of surprise, others of understanding. With each word that came out of her mouth, Helena felt stronger, more connected to her mission. She continued, describing the incident with the police officer and the impact it had had not only on her life, but on the lives of everyone who faces discrimination on a daily basis. If we don't address these issues within our own system, how can we expect society to change? We, as judges, must be on the front lines in the fight against injustice. We need to implement measures that ensure that everyone, regardless of their color or background, is treated with dignity and respect in our courtroom. A wave of murmurs ran through the room. Helena saw thoughtful faces, some looking uncomfortable, others admiring. But she knew she had to be firm, even in the face of possible adverse reactions. After finishing her presentation, Helena waited for a response. and the room fell silent for what seemed like a long moment. The head judge finally spoke, praising Helena for her courage in bringing up such an important issue. It is challenging to recognize that even in our position, we may fail to see the injustices happening around us. But it is essential that we continue to discuss and implement change. The comments that followed were mixed, with some colleagues supporting Helena's proposal and others expressing concerns about implementing new policies. However, as the discussion progressed, Helena's passion and determination proved contagious. Voices began to unite, and slowly, Helena's ideas began to gain traction. During the meeting, a plan began to take shape. The proposal to create a committee on equality and inclusion within the court was raised. Helena could not believe that what had started as an open wound was now turning into a movement for change. At the end of the meeting, as the judges and leaders dispersed, Helena was surrounded by some of her colleagues who expressed support and admiration. She realized that she had found allies where she least expected them, people willing to take on the system alongside her. When she returned home, her heart was light, and a new spirit filled her. What had once seemed like a moment of weakness was becoming an opportunity for growth and transformation, not just for her, but for everyone who faced discrimination and prejudice. She felt like she was finally becoming the woman she had always wanted to be.